This is Outrageous History. Let me ask you something. What characteristics do you think it takes to become the leader of a country? Intelligence? Integrity? Perseverance? Charisma? What about resentment, vengefulness, vindictiveness? After all, leaders are only human. Those characteristics have all played a role in the governing of countries around the world, and even in Canada, where saying you're sorry is a national pastime. Today, we're going to take a look at one of Canada's most unforgettable and provocative prime ministers, George Diefenbaker, who served as the country's 13th leader in the late 1950s and early 1960s, a volatile period of Canadian history. Dief, as he was called, certainly possessed all of those traits I've listed and probably more. To find out more about this remarkable prime minister, let's have a chat with Arthur Milnes. Arthur is a journalist, speechwriter, and historian, currently the in-house historian at the Frontenac Club Hotel in Kingston. Arthur, good to see you, and welcome to Outrageous History.
Oh, thanks, Ernest, and I'm quite thrilled to be here.
So, Arthur, you've worked closely in various capacities with several Canadian prime ministers, Brian Mulroney, Stephen Harper, and John Turner, and you've published a number of books of outstanding speeches of various politicians around the world. George Diefenbaker lived in and served during that period when great oratory was highly valued amongst ordinary citizens. Where do you feel that Diefenbaker stands as far as his reputation for public speaking?
Oh, he's, I guess in my lifetime, I would think nobody tops him, right? Not that I was very young when he died, so it's not like I have any personal experience of seeing a George Diefenbaker speech, but he was a particular master in opposition, particularly on the floor of the House of Commons. He served for 39 years as a member. And he was at his best when he was on the attack. And one would be a very naive Liberal cabinet minister who wasn't prepared well when Dief got into a mood.
And he honed his craft as a lawyer back in Saskatchewan, won several high-profile cases, and so he knew what he was doing by the time he started running for office.
Oh, totally, and he also through his legal experience could really tear down a witness, a hostile witness in particular. So transfer that to an opposing political figure on the floor of the House, and it's quite a potent match. But on the flip side, out on the hustings, he was very much like John Macdonald or Sir John A. in a sense that he's probably one of the last of our politicians. He was a master of names and personal connections, just like Macdonald. So Dief could be at a campaign rally in Manitoba in 1965 and have met a man in the crowd who he hadn't seen since the 1940 campaign. And Dief would stop. He knew that guy. And it was quite remarkable. As you know, in politics, there's nothing better than a skill for names. And Dief had that. And Dief in full flight on the hustings was something we don't see enough of these days. He knew that public speaking, particularly in the political realm, it's not just content, it's entertainment, it's presence. And again, as you referenced, through his law, his effectiveness as a cross-examiner and just as a defense lawyer, a master of the courtroom, he brought what great skills to bring to the election stage.
And he was successful. Had at that time, was it 1956 or 57 that he came up with a minority government, but following an election, followed it up with the biggest landslide ever, and so he was successful as well in Parliament. But then some of those other negative characteristics came out shortly afterwards. It didn't take too long in his as he was governing.
Yeah, he reminds me of, if we could switch to the United States for a second, there's an incredible quote that one of Lyndon Johnson's, or descriptive that one of Lyndon Johnson's assistants used to describe Lyndon Johnson. And I think it applies in Mr. Diefenbaker's case, which is Jack Valente said of LBJ that he was the U.S. president most reeking of human juices. And that's not bad. And, I think it applies to Dief, because you're absolutely correct. He was very much a lone wolf. He, again, particularly as a defense lawyer, he was the outsider fighting the system. And unfortunately, being an outsider, he saw himself as an outsider and ostracized by the elites. And the definition of the elites changed through various parts of his career. And those demons were his undoing in many ways.
And that a lot of that resentment, did you feel that was somewhat passed down from his family, from his mother, who was Scottish and sort of harbored some resentment towards the English, and also the family's financial situation, even back in Ontario before they moved west to Saskatchewan, they weren't in the best financial shape, and so he sort of developed that type of resentment towards the elites or the riches.
Well, playing psychoanalyst, I also think let's consider where he started operating in a political sense. He was in Saskatchewan. The Conservative Party in Ottawa often were pursuing policies that he knew instinctively would not sell on the prairies. So he was the outsider there. He always felt that he wasn't assisted enough by head office, for lack of a better phrase. When he was campaigning, he took over the Saskatchewan Conservative Party when it was built with nothing. He had to put it together, a lot of it with his own money. He was always the loner, And I actually, in fairness, I don't know a lot about his mother, so you got me on that one. But I 100% agree that so many of these resentments were his undoing. And also another thing that we sometimes forget about, until he became Prime Minister of Canada, he had never been an administrator of anything besides a two-person law office. So then you become MP, and he was very much, he had friends, particularly when his first wife was alive, Edna. Friends in the political realm, but he was still an outsider, and he had not administered. So he then administered a House of Commons staff when you actually shared an assistant and things like that. And then all of a sudden, he took over the government of Canada, which is a massive organization. And he, because of his viewing himself as the outsider all the time, he was very suspicious of the public service, for example. And let's be fair, the Liberals have been in for since 1935. So a healthy suspicion is not going to hurt. But he took it to extremes, and his government faltered as a result.
No, I guess we have to be fair and say that he did bring in a number of progressive policies, or that what would be considered that at that time, bringing in an Indigenous senator. Was it the first female cabinet minister?
Yeah,
And,
Ellen Fairclough. Yeah.
some of his policies, like civil rights. So he did have all those very positive aspects into that government.
Oh, and I would argue in many ways he has great legacies, and you've just outlined them, some of them. Another one that brings me personal pride today as a Canadian is his leadership role in battling apartheid against South Africa. He really broke ranks with the, quote, white dominions, Canada's natural allies, and he stood with the non-white leaders of the Commonwealth. He stood united with them, which was just unheard of. And the pressure they put on over the objections of Great Britain were so strong that South Africa left the Commonwealth. So that's something that is a definite positive in his ledger. And also, like you mentioned, it was Sir John A. Macdonald was the first prime minister to grant voting rights to Indigenous people. And in Macdonald's time, that was so progressive and scared people that the Liberals took that away when Laurier came to power. So Diefenbaker restored that right that Macdonald had also fought for. He had a real affinity with John A. Macdonald. Mm-hmm. And another part of his legacy that academics and professors and intellectuals don't get about Diefenbaker, I think, is for a whole generation, and many of them were young men in their 20s, and like my family, my father grew up in a very insular Toronto, and all of a sudden, this exciting man came on the stage and challenged people like my father to envision a greater Canada, a Canada from, sea to signing sea, and then throw in the North. So because of that directly, my father spoke of Mr. Diefenbaker the rest of his life. Dad traveled to all provinces and territories. And that directly came from Diefenbaker inspiring this nationalism in him. And Dad, probably hundreds of thousands. My dad loved Diefenbaker till the day my father died. I disagreed with some of his policies, right? But really felt that no leader after sparked that nationalism that Diefenbaker did. West to north, to east to west. It's exciting stuff.
So he had all these positive qualities, and it seems so unfortunate that that the negative characteristics took over during really a short time that he governed, and who knows what could have happened if he was able to keep that tone down, that resentment, because by 1965, I believe that was that the last time that he he lost the election, I believe, 65?
Yeah, that was his last as party leader. He had been defeated in 1963. But the interesting thing, to zip ahead, to talk about 1965, is basically his own party was done with him by 1965. He was bitter, he was nasty, he was anything but a colleague, but he had this grip on millions of Canadians. So that campaign in 65 was a one-person campaign. It was Dief on a train by himself, and he single-handedly basically won 100 seats, and he held the Liberals to a minority. It's an incredible story. It's like Harry Truman in 1948 in many ways. And it just a remarkable campaign. And to me, the famous quote of his that everybody's against me except the people
Mm-hmm.
really came true in that 1965 election. The people in small towns and isolated regions that Dief was their champion, and they stood by him when nobody else did. It was a remarkable campaign. One of my bucket list books I haven't written. So,
And during the leadership campaign that followed after the election, then really that sealed the resentment, and I think it negatively influenced what happened to the Tory party for years afterwards.
oh, and he was a horrible man to have in your caucus
Mm-hmm.
afterwards. Some of when Mr. Clark became the first and only conservative to defeat Pierre Trudeau, and you would think if you're a conservative, that's quite a accomplishment. And immediately after, Diefenbaker told the press some dismissive comment that the office of the prime minister is too important to leave to any ordinary Joe. That's nasty stuff. And he led a revolt
Mm-hmm.
against bilingualism in 1969, exactly when Mr. Stanfield and others were trying to do the right thing with greater outreaches to Quebec. Um, he then he made Bob Stanfield's life miserable. He made Joe Clark's life miserable, and I think he made his own life miserable. And by the end of
Mm-hmm.
his life, very sad, he had a small band of very young people, loyalists around him, and that was it. He was very poisonous to be around, particularly in a caucus or something. But on the flip side, he lived long enough to literally see himself become a living legend. So it's so full of contradictions that it's an incredibly fascinating
Mm-hmm.
story. But his resentments and things, I believe, have also prevented uh, a great deal of biographical work to be performed on Mr. Diefenbaker because, you know, so many people, when they want to write and research Mr. Diefenbaker, they go down that rabbit hole, and they don't like what they find. Again, it's this
Mm-hmm.
personal stuff. And, I've had in my career a lot of senior former Liberal cabinet ministers under Mr. Pearson who, not only would John Diefenbaker slice and dice, a minister, he would crush them if he could, crush them personally. It was vicious stuff. But then he had favorites. He always liked Paul Martin Sr., another grand parliamentarian.
Mm-hmm.
And I've just been rereading that wonderful book about his first wife, the other Mrs. Diefenbaker. And I had forgotten that without telling John Diefenbaker, Mr. Martin was Minister of Health. And when he heard that Edna Diefenbaker had leukemia, he contacted doctors in the United States who were working on a new treatment. And Dief, forever respected and thanked Paul Martin for that. So there weren't too many, though. Another person, though, he got along, no surprise, with would be Tommy Douglas.
Mm.
And to go to his strengths again, like Saskatchewan is pretty remarkable. And, the one thing Canadians are we always talk about in modern times is key to our identity is Medicare. Well, I've long felt that Mr. Diefenbaker doesn't get the proper credit he too deserves for that battle. And it's quite interesting because he appoints his law partner, Emmett Hall, the Royal Commission that lays the groundwork for all this. And you have these three Western Canadians, three men from Saskatchewan, Emmett Hall, Tommy Douglas, and John Diefenbaker, who all in their own way play this incredible role. And as the Douglas government and the government that the premier that succeeded him, they faced down the entire American Medical Association. So that this largely rural province was up against economic and political giants, and they all held firm. And I thought the Dief sometimes deserves more credit in the fight for Medicare than he gets usually. Right?
And Saskatchewan wasn't even a province when Diefenbaker was a young boy.
Yeah, it was hard to believe. It was the Northwest Territories. Right?
But speaking of Diefenbaker as a young boy, we have to. No discussion about him is complete without without the newspaper boy story. Him meeting his idol, Prime Minister Sir Wilfrid Laurier in Saskatoon. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So as the story goes, Sir Wilfrid, as you know, who's the Prime Minister that helps usher in Saskatchewan and Alberta as full provinces. So Sir Wilfrid is in Saskatoon, and he's on his special Prime Minister train, and he steps out for a walk one morning, and there's the paper boy, young boy named John Diefenbaker, and Laurier buys the paper for a nickel or whatever, and the two start having a nice chat. And then Dief is alleged to have said, I don't have any more time to waste, Prime Minister. I have to go sell papers. Right? And the great thing about John Diefenbaker, if you love politics, and as you know, the great politics, what I love about it is these great storytellers who inhabit all the parties and the old style journalists. And the one thing and Diefenbaker was a master. And one thing they all have in common, and Dief was a master of this, they never let a fact get in the way of a good story, right? So I've known 4 or 5 journalists or historians who've tried to put the Dief-Laurier story together factually, and it just doesn't work. Mm-hmm. Having said that, it's such a good story that I think it should still be told.
Exactly. Yeah, we wouldn't want to let that one go. Now
and another one, if I could mention, if you don't mind, another story that I love about Dief is him standing as the suicide candidate in the by-election against Mackenzie King. It is it's just remarkable, and his respect and admiration secret of Mr. King after that was an interesting little tidbit. So, yes, he was a loner, but I tell you, it takes a lot of courage when you're a middle-aged, lawyer to take on the Prime Minister of Canada. Life would have been a lot easier for Mr. Diefenbaker had he not.
Now, I sent a list of some quotes that he's well known for. Do you have any of your favorites?
I've been thinking about it since you sent it to me, and I can't resist because, as I said earlier, Dief was such a master in the House. And there's the famous story of a rookie Liberal MP named Rick Cashin. And Diefenbaker's up giving a speech, and young Cashin, he's full of piss and vinegar, and he heckles John Diefenbaker. Like, that's suicide, okay, to do that, especially when you're a rookie. And Diefenbaker famously slows, and he points his finger out, doesn't look, but points down to the back bench of the Liberals, and he says, "Mr. Speaker, a big game hunter does not stop for rabbit tracks." Isn't that great?
Yeah, off the top of his head.
Oh, yeah. Or if I know Dief, he probably had it prepared in case he got heckled. I've always loved that story. Brian Mulrooney first told me that. The first time I heard it was Mr. Mulrooney told me that, and Mr. Mulrooney does a great Dief impersonation. So hearing, a former prime minister impersonate John Diefenbaker was just great.
Well, so now to wind this up, Arthur, what do you think should be John Diefenbaker's legacy? Considering the turmoil and those positive moments during his governance and during his lifetime.
Well, if I actually think that in our lifetime since Confederation that we've had 23 prime ministers, and I prefer to look upon them as all 23 did the best and are doing the best they can. And Mr. Diefenbaker has, I would argue, his greatest legacy is the vision, the Diefenbaker vision. And like I said earlier, brought people from places like Ontario to consider British Columbia and the North. And I because of my father's stories, I ended up in the Northwest Territories for 2 years. And that's where I got it from. My father used to talk about Diefenbaker's Canada of the North. And I still think his challenge to us that the North was Canada's call to greatness is still unfulfilled. I still think Northern Canada is our future. And it stirs something in the Canadian imagination. And Mr. Diefenbaker really picked up on that. Now, if I was to be, rational historian and everything, he actually didn't do much with the vision once he got there. Right. And most of the roads to resources in the North were never built. But he took us there. So I'll give him that. Mm-hmm. He's just such a character. And I think he hasn't been studied enough and celebrated enough, right? And you're absolutely correct. Like I've never seen any contradiction with celebrating a past leader yet criticizing the hell out of it. Mm-hmm. But Diefenbaker, we often hear that phrase, larger than life leader, and he was. He truly.
Boy, does that ever apply there?
Yeah, and I think. Up until him, I would think the only I guess there would have been three larger than life prime ministers would obviously be Sir John A. Macdonald of Kingston, Sir Wilfrid Laurier, and then Mr. Diefenbaker himself. It was what a journey. What a journey. And you might have sparked me to start researching that 1965 election book.
Well, I'll take you up on it if that ever gets into print. Mm-hmm. It's been a real pleasure, Arthur. It really has been. And thanks so much for taking time to talk to us about this really intriguing period of Canadian history.
Oh, and full credit to you for creating the podcast. And let's hope that maybe today a young Canadian will listen to this. Mm-hmm. Just us talking about Mr. Diefenbaker and go off to the library and read about Dief and get inspired. And if that happens, then we've both done a good day, sir. Well, I'm hoping that does happen. So thanks again. And I thank all of you for tuning in to Outrageous History. I'm Ernest Granson. We'll see you again soon. Outrageous History is produced by Northern Flicker Media.